Number 1. Scott Peterson, the man who went fishing on Christmas Eve. There are crimes that shake an entire nation, cases that force ordinary people to confront the uncomfortable reality that danger does not always arrive in the form of a stranger. Sometimes it wears the face of a husband, a man who sits at the dinner table, who shares a bed, who holds a hand during a prenatal appointment, and tells the world how excited he is to become a father. The case of Scott Lee Peterson is perhaps the most iconic example of this particular kind of betrayal in modern American history, a case so shocking in its circumstances and so deeply unsettling in its details that it has remained lodged in the public consciousness for more than 2 decades, generating debate, documentaries, legal battles, and a level of media coverage that is almost without parallel in true crime history. To fully understand what happened to Laci Peterson, you have to first understand who she was, because she was not simply a name attached to a headline. She was a real woman with a family who adored her, a future she was actively planning, and an infectious warmth that everyone who knew her described with striking consistency. Laci Denise Rocha was born on May 4, 1975, in Modesto, California, and by all accounts, she grew up as the kind of person who made every room a little brighter simply by being in it. Her mother, Sharon, described her as devoted, warm, and deeply invested in the idea of building a beautiful family life. Laci loved cooking, she loved entertaining, she was a fan of Martha Stewart, and she had a gift for making people feel welcome. She attended California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, and it was there that she met Scott Lee Peterson, a man who presented himself as charming, athletic, and enormously capable. The two fell quickly into a relationship and married in 1997 after a courtship that friends and family described as loving and full of promise. By 2002, the couple had settled into a home in Modesto, California, and Laci was pregnant with the couple's first child, a boy they had already chosen to name Connor. She was 8 months along, due to give birth in February 2003, and by every account that investigators would later gather, she was overjoyed. She was decorating a nursery. She was discussing baby names. She was living the life she had always wanted. Scott Peterson, meanwhile, was living a very different life in private. Investigators would later establish that in the weeks and months before Christmas Eve 2002, Scott had been conducting a romantic relationship with a woman named Amber Frey, a massage therapist from Fresno whom he had met in November 2002 at a work event. Critically, Scott had told Amber Frey that he was not married. He described himself as a widower, a man who had recently lost his wife, a lie that was extraordinary in its coldness, given that at the very moment he was telling it, his pregnant wife was very much alive and awaiting the birth of their son. Amber Frey would later cooperate with law enforcement, and the recorded conversations between her and Scott Peterson during the weeks after Laci's disappearance would become some of the most chilling and revealing pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. On December 24, 2002, Laci Peterson disappeared. Scott reported her missing that evening after returning home, claiming he had spent the day fishing at the Berkeley Marina in San Francisco Bay, an unusual choice for a man with no documented history of serious fishing and who had only recently purchased the boat he claimed to have used that day. The search for Laci Peterson began immediately and became one of the largest missing persons efforts California had ever seen. Her face was everywhere. Volunteers flooded the streets of Modesto. The story took on a life of its own in the national media, and very quickly, attention turned to Scott Peterson himself, not because of any single dramatic piece of evidence, but because of the accumulation of details that investigators found deeply troubling. Scott Peterson's behavior in the days and weeks after Laci's disappearance struck investigators and those close to the family as profoundly inconsistent with that of a genuinely grieving husband. He continued his contact with Amber Frey. He had recently taken out a substantial life insurance policy on Laci. He had sold her car. He had contacted a real estate agent to inquire about listing the family home. He had also told Amber Frey, before Laci's body was found and before he was arrested, that he had lost his wife, language that investigators believed was a very deliberate and calculated form of communication. The Modesto Police Department and the Stanislaus County District Attorney's Office built their case carefully and methodically over the months that followed Laci's disappearance. In April 2003, the investigation took a devastating turn that removed any remaining hope that Laci might be found alive. The remains of a woman and an infant were discovered along the shoreline of San Francisco Bay, not far from the marina where Scott claimed to have been fishing on Christmas Eve. Within days, those remains were confirmed through DNA analysis to be Laci Peterson and her unborn son Connor. On the same day that the identification was confirmed, April 18, 2003, Scott Peterson was arrested in La Jolla, California. He had dyed his hair and beard and was carrying substantial amounts of cash, along with his brother's identification, details that prosecutors would later argue were consistent with a man preparing to flee. Scott Peterson was charged with 2 counts of murder, first degree for the killing of Laci, and second degree for the killing of their unborn son Connor, under the California Unborn Victims of Violence Act. He pleaded not guilty to both charges. The trial, which began in June 2004 in Redwood City after a change of venue was granted due to the extraordinary level of publicity in Stanislaus County, became a national spectacle. Court cameras broadcast daily proceedings to a transfixed public. Legal commentators dissected every piece of testimony. Amber Frey took the stand and told the court about her relationship with Scott, about the lies he had told her, and about the recorded phone conversations she had conducted with him at the request of investigators. The prosecution argued that Scott Peterson had ended the lives of his wife and unborn son because he wanted to be free of the responsibilities of family and free to pursue his life with Amber Frey without consequence. The defense, led by attorney Mark Garagos, argued that Laci Peterson had been taken from the street near her home by persons unknown, that Scott was innocent, and that the circumstantial nature of the evidence against him was insufficient to support a conviction. The defense pointed to a reported burglary near the Peterson home and various other alternative theories. On November 12, 2004, after weeks of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on both counts of murder. Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, who had been a fixture at the trial, wept openly. The sentencing phase that followed resulted in the jury recommending the death penalty, and Scott Peterson was formally sentenced to death by the court in March 2005. He was transferred to San Quentin State Prison's death row, where he remained for more than 15 years. The legal story of Scott Peterson did not end with that sentence. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned his death sentence after determining that jurors who held reservations about capital punishment had been improperly dismissed during the penalty phase of the trial. The court was careful to note that it was not overturning his conviction, only the sentence. In December 2021, Scott Peterson appeared before a judge and was formally resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He has continued to maintain his innocence from behind bars, and his legal team has pursued every available avenue to challenge the conviction itself. The case took a further dramatic turn in January 2024 when the Los Angeles Innocence Project, a nonprofit organization that represents individuals who claim wrongful conviction and seek to prove actual innocence, announced that it had taken up Scott Peterson's case and was actively investigating his claim of innocence. The organization stated that it was pursuing new evidence related to the original trial. As of the current date, Scott Peterson's conviction has not been overturned, and he remains incarcerated, but his case is actively contested and is being examined through formal legal channels. His sister-in-law, Janet Peterson, has been a vocal advocate for him, arguing publicly that investigators failed to adequately explore alternative explanations for Laci's disappearance, and that the intense media coverage of the case made a fair trial essentially impossible. Those who believe in his guilt Point to the affair with Amber Frey, the life insurance policy, the fishing trip to the very bay where Laci's body was later found, and the overall pattern of behavior in the weeks following her disappearance as evidence that is simply too compelling to ignore. The broader cultural impact of the Laci Peterson case is difficult to overstate. It prompted significant legislative debate about the rights of unborn children under criminal law. It sparked national conversations about intimate partner violence, about the domestic homicide statistics that organizations had been tracking for years, and about the ways in which perpetrators of such crimes are able to maintain a public facade while committing acts of profound betrayal in private. Laci Peterson's mother, Shanann Watts, went on to become an advocate for the Unborn Victims of Violence Act at the federal level, legislation that passed in 2004 and recognizes harm to an unborn child as a separate criminal offense when committed during the commission of a federal crime. The law is informally known as Laci and Connor's Law. Shanann Watts' advocacy work transformed one family's unimaginable grief into a lasting change in American federal law, a legacy that Laci herself would have had no reason to anticipate when she was going about the ordinary business of preparing for her son's arrival in the winter of 2002. For the family and friends who knew Laci Peterson, the decades since her disappearance have been defined by a grief that does not diminish. A grief compounded by the legal battles that have kept her name in headlines long after the initial tragedy. Brent Rocha, Laci's brother, has spoken over the years about the way in which the ongoing legal proceedings forced the family to relive the worst experience of their lives repeatedly, each new hearing or announcement bringing the pain back to the surface. Shanann Rocha described the last time she saw her daughter in court, a woman who was full of life and looking forward to the birth of her child, and whose absence has left a permanent wound in the family she left behind. The couple's friends from their college years have spoken about the person they knew, someone who was genuinely kind and genuinely happy, who had no idea that the man she had chosen to build her life with harbored intentions that would cost her everything. The case of Laci and Scott Peterson remains one of the most studied, most debated, and most written about criminal cases in American history, precisely because it touches something that people find deeply, viscerally disturbing. The idea that the person most trusted with your safety, the person who stood beside you and made vows of love and protection, could be the source of the greatest possible harm, is a truth that most people find almost impossible to fully absorb. Investigations into domestic homicide consistently find that intimate partners represent one of the highest risk categories for women of childbearing age, and the Peterson case brought that statistical reality into sharp, human, personal focus in a way that no abstract figure ever could. Laci Peterson was not a statistic. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, an expectant mother who was counting down the weeks to the birth of her son. That is who she was, and that is who the criminal justice system, imperfect as it may be, ultimately sought to speak for in a courtroom in Redwood City in the autumn of 2004. Number 2. Christopher Watts, the husband who went on television to beg for their return. There are cases in the history of American true crime that manage to be simultaneously impossible to comprehend and yet, in retrospect, devastatingly clear in their trajectory. The Watts family murders of August 2018 belong firmly in that category. Christopher Lee Watts was, by outward appearance, a perfectly ordinary man. He was 33 years old. He worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum in Weld County, Colorado. He lived with his wife and 2 young daughters in a comfortable home in the suburb of Frederick, and he presented to the world the image of a devoted family man. His wife Shanann was 34 years old, 15 weeks pregnant with the couple's 3rd child, a boy they had decided to name Nico Lee Watts, and she was by all accounts a vibrant, energetic, and deeply loving mother who documented her family's life openly and warmly on social media, where she had built a substantial following through her work as a brand ambassador. The couple's daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste, were by every account adored by everyone who knew them. The family seemed, from the outside, to be exactly what Christopher Watts would have wanted people to believe they were. The reality, as investigators would piece together in the weeks following the disappearance of the Watts family, was profoundly different. In the summer of 2018, Christopher Watts had begun an affair with a woman named Nicole Kessinger, a co-worker he had met through his employment at the petroleum contractor. Kessinger would later tell investigators and journalists that she had been unaware that Watts was still married, that he had presented himself to her as a man in the process of separating from his wife, and that when she realized the full extent of what had happened, she immediately cooperated with law enforcement. The affair was the central motivating factor that investigators and prosecutors would point to throughout the investigation, the lens through which the events of August 13, 2018, would be examined and ultimately understood. On the morning of August 13, 2018, Shanann Watts returned home to Frederick after a work trip. According to the timeline that Christopher Watts would eventually provide to investigators, a confrontation took place in the bedroom of the family home. What happened in that home, in the early hours of that Monday morning, resulted in the deaths of Shanann Watts and both of their daughters. Christopher Watts disposed of the bodies at a remote location owned by Anadarko Petroleum, where he was employed, burying Shanann in a shallow grave and concealing the girls inside oil storage tanks at the facility. He then returned home, went about his morning routine, and waited. When Shanann's friend and colleague noticed that she had missed a scheduled appointment and was not responding to messages, she called the police. Officers arrived at the Watts home for a welfare check, and it was in the aftermath of that visit that the case entered the public consciousness in a way that would consume the national news cycle for weeks. Christopher Watts stood in the street outside his home and spoke to local television reporters, appealing for information about his missing wife and daughters, claiming he had no idea where they were, and describing his longing to have his family returned to him safely. The footage of that interview, which was broadcast repeatedly across television networks and spread rapidly across social media, became one of the most analyzed pieces of video in recent true crime history, as viewers and investigators alike noted the ways in which his demeanor seemed inconsistent with the raw distress of a genuinely frightened husband and father. The investigation that followed moved quickly and with remarkable efficiency. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the Frederick Police Department worked together with the FBI as federal agents became involved, given the connection to Anadarko Petroleum's federally regulated facilities. A polygraph examination was conducted. Investigators reviewed security footage from the neighborhood and from the Anadarko facility. Phone records were examined. The picture that emerged from this investigative work was one of a man who had taken the most catastrophic possible action to solve a problem he could not otherwise see his way out of. Within days of the disappearance, Christopher Watts was arrested. The bodies of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were located at the Anadarko facility, exactly as investigators had suspected. In the weeks and months that followed the arrest, Christopher Watts provided investigators with multiple conflicting accounts of what had taken place inside the family home. He initially attempted to shift responsibility for the deaths of the girls onto Shanann herself, a claim that investigators and prosecutors found wholly inconsistent with the evidence. He would later, in a series of interviews conducted at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, where he was transferred after sentencing, provide more detailed and more candid accounts of what had occurred, though investigators and victim advocates have noted the continued inconsistencies in his various tellings of events. On November 6, 2018, Christopher Watts appeared in a Weld County courtroom and pleaded guilty to 9 charges, including 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy for the death of unborn Nico, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. The plea agreement was reached with the approval of the Rzucek family, Shanann's parents, who made the decision that they did not wish to pursue the death penalty, a decision that Frank Rzucek explained in court, with a level of dignity and raw pain that left no one in the courtroom unmoved. Sandy Rzucek, Shanann's mother, addressed the court directly and told Christopher Watts, while weeping, that she had no idea who had given him the right to take the lives of her daughter and grandchildren, that she knew God and his angels had been present in those final moments, and that she prayed for mercy to be shown to him because that was not her right to determine. It was an extraordinary moment of grace from a family that had every reason to want the most severe punishment the law could provide. On November 19, 2018, Judge Marcelo Kopkow sentenced Christopher Watts at the Weld County District Court. He received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. He was additionally sentenced to 48 years for the unlawful termination of the pregnancy of Shanann Watts, 2 further life sentences for the murders of children under the age of 12, and 36 years across the 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body, all to run consecutively. Before the sentence was read, Frank Rzucek addressed his son-in-law directly from the courtroom and told him, with a grief that was palpable throughout the room, that he had trusted him to take care of his daughter and grandchildren, that they had trusted him, and that he had taken them out like trash. He called him a heartless monster, and then he sat down. The judge, in delivering the sentence, described the crime as perhaps the most inhumane and vicious he had seen in thousands of cases across his career. Christopher Watts is currently serving his sentence at an undisclosed out-of-state correctional facility, the location of which the Colorado Department of Corrections has declined to reveal for security reasons. He has participated in additional interviews with investigators since his incarceration, and the materials from those interviews, including detailed written accounts of the events of August 13, 2018, have been released through public records requests and have formed the basis of several documentary films and investigative journalism pieces. Shanann's family has expressed their ongoing grief at the way in which those productions have brought the case back into public attention repeatedly over the years since the murders, and Shanann's brother Frankie Rzucek has been particularly vocal about the pain caused by the continued public fascination with the case. The impact of what Christopher Watts did to his family extends far beyond the immediate tragedy of 3 lives ended and 1 unborn life never given the chance to begin. Shanann Watts had built a genuine community online, a following of people who had followed her family's life, watched her daughters grow, celebrated alongside her through the social media posts that chronicled birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday afternoons. Those people experienced a form of grief that is unique to the modern era, the grief of losing people you felt you knew without ever having met them. The domestic violence advocacy community pointed to the Watts case as a textbook illustration of the statistics that researchers had been documenting for years, namely that pregnancy is one of the periods of highest risk for women experiencing intimate partner violence, and that the perpetrators in such cases are overwhelmingly individuals known to and trusted by the victim. Shanann Watts had no warning, had no reason to fear the man she had chosen as her partner and the father of her children. And that absence of warning is perhaps the most disturbing element of the entire case. Number 3. Beau Rothwell, the husband who kept a pros and cons list. The case of Beau and Jennifer Rothwell is one that stands out even within the deeply troubling category of intimate partner violence cases for the particular details that emerged during the investigation and trial. Details that paint a portrait of a man who had reduced the question of his wife's life to a kind of cold calculation, an accounting exercise, a list of factors to be weighed before a decision was made. What makes this case especially haunting is the context in which the crime occurred, the fact that Jennifer Rothwell had only recently discovered she was pregnant, that she was so worried about her husband's reaction to the news that she had searched for guidance online, and that her search history would later become one of the most devastating pieces of evidence in the case, not against her, but as a window into the fear and uncertainty she had been living with in the weeks before she was taken from the world. Jennifer Rothwell was 28 years old, and worked as a marketing professional in the St. Louis, Missouri area. She was described by friends and family as bright, warm, and full of life. Her mother, Robin von Hausen, would later tell the court that Jennifer was a bright light in their lives and that they had believed they would have far more than 28 years with her. Jennifer had been married to Beau Rothwell, who was 31 at the time of the crime, and the couple lived in Creve Coeur, a suburban community west of St. Louis. By the autumn of 2019, the marriage was under significant strain that Jennifer may not have fully understood the extent of, because Beau Rothwell had been conducting a romantic affair with another woman, a fact he had concealed from his wife. When Jennifer Rothwell discovered she was pregnant, she found herself navigating a situation that was complicated, in ways she was only beginning to understand. She searched on her cell phone, in the weeks before her disappearance, for the phrase, "What to do if your husband is upset you are pregnant." That search, discovered by investigators during the examination of her phone records, became one of the most striking and heartbreaking pieces of evidence in the entire case. It told a story without words, a story of a woman who was trying to find a way to have a difficult conversation with a man she was no longer certain she could predict. A woman who was 6 weeks pregnant and worried about how her husband would respond to news that should have been a cause for celebration. Beau Rothwell had been conducting his affair for some time and had, according to the evidence presented at trial, been actively weighing his options with a level of detachment that prosecutors described as evidence of a calculating and premeditated mindset. Investigators discovered that he had literally made a written list of the pros and cons of leaving his wife, a document that formed part of the prosecution's case and that spoke volumes about the way in which he had been approaching his marriage during this period. He had exchanged text messages with the woman he was having an affair with. He had been considering his options, as he would later testify, and had decided that the right course of action was to confess the affair to Jennifer and ask for her mercy, to tell her the truth and hope for the best. On November 11, 2019, Beau Rothwell had that conversation with Jennifer. According to his own testimony at trial, an argument broke out, one that he described as intensely heated and emotionally overwhelming. He testified that during the argument, he struck Jennifer from behind with a mallet, that she stumbled and fell, and that he struck her again. He told the court that she was unresponsive on the stairs and that he was unable to determine whether she was still alive. What followed was not the act of a man in shock or a man who panicked and then immediately sought help. What followed was a sustained and deliberate attempt to conceal what had happened. Beau Rothwell cleaned the home extensively, using bleach on the carpets where Jennifer had fallen. He disposed of the materials he had used in the cleanup. He then reported his wife as missing on November 12, 2019, placing himself in the position of a concerned husband searching for answers. Investigators who responded to the missing persons report and who searched the Rothwell home found evidence that told a very different story. Police discovered that carpet in the home had been soaked with bleach, but that despite the cleaning effort, blood evidence remained present. The discovery of that evidence led to Beau Rothwell being charged with his wife's murder even before her body had been found, a relatively unusual step that reflected the strength of the early forensic evidence. Jennifer Rothwell's remains were discovered approximately 45 miles northwest of the family home, in a location outside St. Louis County, approximately a week after she was reported missing. The trial of Beau Rothwell was notable for the fact that he took the witness stand himself and admitted to causing Jennifer's death, while simultaneously arguing that the killing had not been premeditated. His legal team sought to have him convicted on a charge of voluntary manslaughter rather than first-degree murder, arguing that the confrontation had been spontaneous and emotionally driven rather than planned and calculated. Prosecutors pushed back forcefully on this characterization, pointing to the pros and cons list, the text messages with the other woman, the cleanup of the crime scene, and the sustained effort to mislead investigators as evidence of a man who was neither impulsive nor overcome by emotion, but who was, at every stage, making deliberate and considered decisions. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder, along with the charges of tampering with physical evidence and abandonment of a corpse. Beau Rothwell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in July 2022. In court at his sentencing, he addressed Jennifer's family and said that words could not describe how sorry he was. He closed his eyes as the verdict was read at his trial and exhaled, a moment that observers in the courtroom found deeply unsettling in its composure. Prosecuting attorney Wesley Bell stated that the conviction meant that the man who had taken the life of his pregnant wife would spend the rest of his life in prison, without any possibility of release. Jennifer's mother spoke of the loss of her daughter with a grief that was evident in every word she offered, describing Jennifer as a bright light, as someone whose presence had been irreplaceable and whose absence had left a permanent and devastating mark on the family she left behind. The Rothwell case drew significant public attention not only because of the crime itself, but because of the particular details that surrounded it. The discovery of Jennifer's final phone searches struck a chord with people who heard about the case, because it illustrated in an almost unbearably direct way the reality of living with a partner whose true feelings you cannot fully access. Jennifer Rothwell had sensed something, had been worried enough to search for guidance, had been trying to navigate a situation she did not yet have the full picture of. She had no way of knowing that the man who was supposedly weighing his options and deciding what to do about their marriage had already, in some fundamental sense, made his decision. The digital trail she left behind became a way for the world to know something about her experience in those final weeks, and it is a record that humanizes her in a way that raw case facts alone cannot achieve. Number 4. Alex Guajardo, the husband who called 911 himself. There are cases that expose not only individual acts of terrible violence, but also the systemic failures that allowed those acts to occur, moments when the structures that exist to protect the vulnerable broke down in ways that cost someone their life. The case of Alex Guajardo and Caitlynne Rose Infinger Guajardo in Pasadena, Texas, in August 2019, is precisely such a case, one that became a flashpoint for an urgent public debate about the bail system in Harris County, and that directly inspired proposed legislation bearing Caitlynne's name. The tragedy of what happened to Caitlynne Guajardo is made even more unbearable by the fact that she had done everything right. She had called the police. She had reported her husband. She had stood up for herself in the way that advocates for victims of domestic violence encourage women to do, and the system had released him anyway. Caitlynne Rose Infinger Guajardo was 20 years old at the time of her death, a young mother already raising an 8-month-old daughter named Alexis, and 4 months pregnant with a second child. By the accounts of those who loved her, Caitlynne was a woman who was trying to build a good life in difficult circumstances. Her mother, Melanie Infinger, would later describe her daughter as someone she was enormously proud of, a woman who had shown real courage by standing up to her husband and contacting the authorities when he behaved violently toward her. That courage, that decision to call the police and hold her husband accountable, should have been the beginning of Caitlynne's protection. Instead, through a catastrophic failure of the system that was supposed to keep her safe, it created the conditions for her death. Alex Guajardo had a documented history of violent and troubling behavior in the period leading up to August 2019. On August 3, 2019, Caitlynne called police and reported that her husband had struck her. She also reported that he had taken the life of the family's pet cat, a detail that investigators and domestic violence researchers recognize as a significant warning sign in cases involving intimate partner violence, because harm to animals in a domestic setting is strongly associated with an escalating pattern of coercive and dangerous behavior. Guajardo was arrested on the basis of these allegations and charged with assault of a family member. What happened next is the element of this case that provoked the most intense public anger and the most sustained scrutiny of the Harris County judicial system. Just 17 hours after his arrest, Alex Guajardo was released from jail. A magistrate judge granted him what is known as a personal recognizance bond, a form of release that requires no monetary payment and rests entirely on the defendant's promise to appear for future court proceedings. No no-contact order was issued as a condition of his release. Caitlynne Guajardo was not informed in any meaningful way that the man who had struck her and taken the life of their cat had been freed and was at liberty to return to the address they shared. Pasadena Police Chief Josh Bruger would later state publicly, and with evident frustration, that in his view the bail decision was at least partly responsible for what happened next. Within hours of his release, Alex Guajardo returned to the Pasadena apartment on Southmore Avenue, where he and Caitlynne lived. On August 5, 2019, Guajardo called 911 himself and told the dispatcher that he had taken his wife's life and needed help. When officers arrived at the apartment, they found Guajardo outside, covered in blood, and he told police directly that he had intentionally targeted Caitlynne's abdomen during the attack in order to ensure that if she survived, no one else would be able to raise his child. Those words were recorded by officers and became part of the evidentiary record of the case. Caitlynne, who had been found inside the apartment with more than 20 stab wounds, including wounds to her abdomen and throat, was transported to an area hospital where she was pronounced dead. The couple's unborn son also did not survive. The investigation was, in some respects, straightforward, because Guajardo had confessed at the scene and had been apprehended without incident. The forensic and testimonial evidence against him was overwhelming. What the investigation and subsequent legal proceedings actually illuminated was the pattern of behavior that had preceded the crime, the prior arrests, the prior bonds, the history of domestic incidents that had been documented by law enforcement without resulting in conditions that would have kept Caitlynne safe. Harris County District Attorney Kim Ogg would later state publicly that the case highlighted the dangers and red flags of domestic violence and that all of those signs had been present for the system to see. The legal case against Alex Guajardo moved through the courts over the following years. He was charged with 2 counts of capital murder for the deaths of Caitlynne and their unborn son. While he was in custody awaiting trial, he was found in possession of improvised weapons, a discovery that resulted in additional charges and additional prison time being attached to his eventual sentence. In October 2024, Alex Daniel Guajardo appeared in a Harris County courtroom and entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison, plus an additional 10 years for the weapons charge. He read a handwritten letter in court in which his attorney said he took full accountability for what he had done. The sentence means he will never be released. The case gave rise to proposed legislation that became known informally as Caitlynne's Law. Texas State Senator Paul Bettencourt introduced Senate Bill 532, which was designed to restrict the ability of judges to issue personal recognizance bonds to defendants who had already received such bonds or who faced multiple felony charges. The bill aimed to prevent a repetition of the circumstances that had led to Guajardo's release 17 hours after his initial arrest. The proposed legislation did not ultimately pass into law during the session in which it was introduced, a fact that Caitlynne's family and advocates for domestic violence victims found deeply frustrating and deeply disappointing, but the bill represented a tangible effort to translate a specific tragedy into systemic change. Melanie Infinger, Caitlynne's mother, has continued to speak publicly about her daughter's case and about the importance of bail reform as a protective measure for victims of domestic violence, and her advocacy has kept the conversation alive in the years since Caitlynne's death. The legacy of Caitlynne Guajardo is one that her family has worked to ensure is not defined solely by the manner of her death. She was a young mother who was looking forward to the birth of her second child. She had an 8-month-old daughter at home who needed her. She had a mother who was proud of her and who has made it her purpose to speak for the woman Caitlynne was and for the changes that might have saved her. In a case that exposed the way in which systemic failures can contribute directly to individual tragedies, Caitlynne's story represents both the human cost of those failures and the ongoing responsibility of the justice system to do better. Number 5. Seth Techel, the husband who pointed the finger at a neighbor. The case of Seth Techel and his wife Lisa in rural Iowa in 2012 is one that tested the patience, the resources, and the determination of the criminal justice system in ways that few cases do, requiring 3 separate trials before a jury was ultimately able to agree on a verdict. It is a case about a young couple who had been high school sweethearts, who had married in the autumn of 2011 full of plans and expectations, who had moved into their first home together and were expecting their first child, a daughter they had already named Zoe, and whose ordinary and promising beginning was shattered by a set of choices made by one of them in secret. Lisa Techel was 23 years old and working as a county jailer at the Washington County Jail in Iowa. She had also served as a reserve deputy sheriff, a woman who had chosen a career in law enforcement and who was described by her colleagues and her family as hard-working, dedicated, and deeply committed to the people she loved. Her father, Todd Caldwell, was himself a sheriff's deputy in the same county, and the family was well known and well respected in the close-knit community of Ottawa and the surrounding area. Lisa was 17 weeks pregnant with the couple's first child when she was taken from the world in the early hours of May 26, 2012. Seth Techel was 21 years old at the time of the crime. He had hoped to pursue a career in law enforcement himself, following in the path of his wife and her family, and had recently begun working as a jailer in the neighboring Wapello County. By the spring of 2012, however, Seth Techel was conducting a romantic relationship with a co-worker named Rachel McFarland, a woman he had met at a job training center in Ottawa, where the two worked together. The text messages between Seth and Rachel that investigators would later recover were described by the prosecutor at trial as reading like a countdown, messages in which Seth made promises to Rachel about leaving his wife and beginning a new life with her. According to testimony and evidence presented at trial, Seth Techel received an ultimatum from Rachel to make good on those promises and end his marriage. In the early morning hours of May 26, 2012, Seth Techel called emergency services in a state of distress and told dispatchers that he had been in the shower when an intruder broke into the family home and caused the death of his wife as she slept. He claimed he had heard a sound and emerged from the bathroom to find Lisa in the bedroom, unresponsive, and had then gone outside to see a vehicle driving away from the property. Officers who responded to the call found no evidence of forced entry and no evidence consistent with the presence of an intruder, but the investigation that followed was complicated by the existence of a neighbor with whom the Techels had been engaged in a bitter and escalating property dispute. Seth Techel's defense attorneys would point to this neighbor, a man named Brian Tate who had severe mental health difficulties, as an alternative suspect, and that alternative theory proved effective enough in the first 2 trials to prevent the juries from reaching a unanimous verdict. Brian Tate died unexpectedly in September 2012, just months after Lisa Techel's death, of what his family attributed to heart failure, brought on in part by the stress of public suspicion that had surrounded him in connection with the case. His death meant he was never able to take the stand in his own defense during the subsequent trials, a circumstance that his family found deeply painful and that added a further layer of tragedy to an already tragic case. Despite Brian Tate's death, prosecutors continued to pursue the case against Seth Techel, gathering additional forensic and circumstantial evidence and building the most comprehensive possible case for the 3rd trial. At the 3rd trial, held in Davenport, Iowa, in July 2014, prosecutors presented a body of evidence that included the text messages between Seth and Rachel, the absence of any physical evidence of forced entry or of an intruder, the recovery of a firearm that investigators believed was the weapon used in the crime, and the timeline of Seth Techel's known movements and communications that investigators argued was inconsistent with his stated account of events. The jury deliberated and returned unanimous verdicts of guilty on both charges of first-degree murder and non-consensual termination of a human pregnancy. Seth Techel showed no visible emotional response when the verdict was read, though his parents and grandfather, seated in the front row of the courtroom, visibly lowered their heads. At sentencing, Lisa Techel's father, Todd Caldwell, addressed Seth Techel directly and told him that he was a cold-blooded person who had taken a life for convenience, that unlike animals who acted out of necessity, Seth had acted out of self-interest and calculation. The judge sentenced Seth Techel to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder charge, the mandatory sentence under Iowa law, along with 25 years for the non-consensual termination of a human pregnancy charge, to run consecutively. The Iowa Court of Appeals upheld the conviction in July 2016 after Seth Techel challenged the sufficiency of the evidence on appeal, with the three-judge panel finding that while the prosecution's case had been largely circumstantial evidence was fully sufficient to support a finding of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Seth Techel is currently serving his sentence at the Anamosa State Penitentiary, a maximum security facility in Iowa. The case of Seth and Lisa Techel resonated deeply in Iowa and beyond for several reasons that go beyond the immediate facts. The three-trial process, which took years and demanded enormous resources from investigators, prosecutors, and the court system, illustrated both the determination of those who sought justice for Lisa and the particular difficulties that arise in cases built on circumstantial rather than direct evidence. The fact that it took 3 attempts to reach a verdict is not necessarily an indictment of the process, so much as a reflection of how seriously the juries in the first 2 trials took their responsibility to be certain before returning a guilty verdict. When certainty was finally reached, it was reached unanimously and firmly, and the conviction has withstood every subsequent legal challenge. For Lisa Techel's family, the road to justice was long and exhausting, but the final outcome meant that the man who had taken their daughter, wife, and the life of their unborn grandchild would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Number 6. Kashif Anwar, the husband who invited his wife on a romantic trip. Among all the cases in this collection, the case of Kashif Anwar and Fawziyah Javed stands out for the particular horror of its setting, and for the extraordinary circumstances in which Fawziyah, despite the severity of her injuries, was able to tell those who came to help her exactly what had happened and who had done it. It is a case set against one of the most recognizable landmarks in the United Kingdom, a case that made international headlines and that prompted an outpouring of grief and anger across Britain, and it is a case that illuminates, with devastating clarity, the particular danger faced by women who are trying to leave abusive relationships. Fawziyah Javed was 31 years old, a qualified employment law solicitor based in Yorkshire, England, and by the accounts of those who knew and loved her, a woman of extraordinary intelligence, warmth, and independence. Her mother, Yasmin Javed, described her daughter as someone who had her own voice, her own opinions, and her own sense of self, qualities that, according to the evidence presented at trial, her husband deeply resented. Fawziyah had married Kashif Anwar on Christmas Day 2020, a marriage that by her own testimony, and the testimony of her family, had been troubled almost from the beginning. Kashif Anwar was 29 years old, a student optician from Pudsey, near Leeds, who had first met Fawziyah when she accompanied her mother to an optician's appointment. Within months of the marriage, Fawziyah had begun to confide in her mother that the relationship was coercive and controlling, that Kashif was abusive toward her, and that she was considering ending the marriage. The evidence gathered during the investigation and presented at trial painted a detailed picture of a controlling and volatile relationship. Fawziyah had secretly recorded conversations in which Kashif Anwar spoke to her in deeply demeaning and threatening terms, telling her not to behave like a British woman, questioning her right to have her own perspective, and making clear that he regarded her independence as a provocation rather than a characteristic to be respected. She had reported his behavior to police on 2 separate occasions, seeking to create a formal record of the abuse without necessarily seeking immediate intervention, and one of those police reports was made just days before the events of September 2021. Her mother had established a coded communication system with her daughter, agreeing that if Fawziyah sent the message that she felt like cream cakes, it would be a signal that she was in danger and needed her mother to contact the authorities on her behalf. The existence of that code, revealed at trial, illustrated the level of fear that Fawziyah had been living with in the months before her death. By September 2021, Fawziyah had made the decision to end her marriage. She had been in contact with divorce lawyers and had been gathering evidence, including the secret recordings, to support her case. She was also approximately 17 weeks pregnant with the couple's first child. The precise nature of the dynamics surrounding the pregnancy and the planned separation are complex, but investigators established that Fawziyah had decided to proceed with raising the child as a single parent following the divorce. In early September 2021, Kashif Anwar proposed what he described as a mini-moon, a short trip to Edinburgh that he presented to Fawziyah as an opportunity for them to spend time together and, according to his later account at trial, attempt a reconciliation. Fawziyah's mother expressed deep concern about the trip, but Fawziyah agreed to go despite her reservations. The couple checked into the Residence Inn in Edinburgh on September 1, 2021, and the following day, September 2, 2021, they walked together to Arthur's Seat, an ancient extinct volcano that rises above the city of Edinburgh and is one of the most visited landmarks in Scotland. On the descent from the summit of Arthur's Seat, Kashif Anwar caused Fawziyah to fall approximately 50 feet down the steep rock face. She sustained catastrophic injuries from the fall. A hiker named Dania Rafiq, 24 years old, was among the first to reach Fawziyah as she lay at the base of the rock face, and the words that Fawziyah spoke to this stranger as she lay dying are the most powerful evidence in the entire case. She told Dania Rafiq not to let her husband near her and that he had pushed her. She repeated the instruction. When Police Constable Rhiannon Clutton arrived at the scene, Fawziyah told the officer what had happened and gave the reason. She had told her husband she wanted to end the marriage. Kashif Anwar was arrested and charged with murder that same night. At his trial, held at the High Court in Edinburgh in March and April 2023, Kashif Anwar denied the charges and claimed that Fawziyah had slipped and that he had accidentally bumped into her as she fell. The prosecution, led by Advocate Depute Alex Prentice, presented the testimony of the witnesses who had reached Fawziyah as she lay dying. The recorded conversations in which Anwar's controlling behavior was clearly audible, the police reports Fawziyah had made, the testimony of her mother and family about the pattern of abuse they had witnessed, and the CCTV footage from the city showing the couple walking together toward Arthur's Seat on the day of the crime. The jury rejected Anwar's defense entirely. The verdict was guilty of the murder of Fawziyah Javed and of causing the death of her unborn child. Judge Lord Beckett imposed the mandatory life sentence at the sentencing hearing in April 2023, with a minimum term of 20 years before any possibility of release could be considered. In sentencing Anwar, the judge told him directly that Fawziyah had been entitled to his protection, that she had trusted that he would keep her safe when she agreed to walk with him up Arthur's Seat, despite both a fear of heights and her pregnancy, and that he had exploited that trust. He told Anwar that he had shown no remorse and had made no attempt to help his wife or save her life. He described the crime as a wicked act. Shouting broke out in the courtroom as Anwar was taken from the dock, a reflection of the intense emotions of the family and supporters who had waited years for the verdict and the sentence. Kashif Anwar subsequently indicated his intention to appeal his conviction and sentence, but then withdrew that appeal, meaning the conviction and the minimum 20-year term stand. Yasmin Javed, Fawziyah's mother, has spoken in the years since the trial about the unbearable grief of losing her only daughter and of knowing the specific circumstances in which that loss occurred. She has described Fawziyah as a brilliant and beautiful woman who deserved to live and to raise her child, and she has spoken about the particular pain of knowing that her daughter's final act was to use what little strength remained to her to tell the truth about what had happened, ensuring that the man who had done it would be held to account. Fawziyah Javed's final words on the hillside at Arthur's Seat were an act of remarkable courage, and they are the reason that her family received the justice they sought. Number 7. Mukhtiar Singh Panghali, the teacher who held a press conference. The case of Mukhtiar Singh Panghali and Manjit Panghali in Surrey, British Columbia, is one that carries with it not only the tragedy of a young woman's life ended and an unborn child lost, but also a subsequent chapter involving the parole system that reignited public grief and anger in Canada many years after the initial conviction. It is a case in which the perpetrator performed, with considerable apparent skill, the role of the grieving and bewildered husband in the immediate aftermath of the crime, holding a tearful public press conference to appeal for help in finding his missing wife, while investigators were already beginning to form their suspicions about what had actually happened inside the family home. Manjit Panghali was 31 years old, a secondary school teacher in the Surrey area, and was described by her family and colleagues as a dedicated, warm, and deeply family-oriented woman. She had married Mukhtiar Singh Panghali, who was himself a secondary school teacher, and the couple had a daughter together who was 3 years old at the time of the events of October 2006. Manjit was 4 months pregnant with the couple's second child when she disappeared. On October 18, 2006, the last confirmed sighting of Manjit Panghali was as she left her prenatal yoga class. She never arrived home. Her husband waited 26 hours before contacting police to report her missing, a delay that investigators considered immediately significant and that would later feature prominently in the prosecution's case. In the days following Manjit's disappearance, Mukhtiar Panghali participated in a public appeal organized by police, appearing before television cameras and pleading for anyone with information about his wife's whereabouts to come forward. The appearance was emotional and, to many observers at the time, appeared to be the behavior of a genuinely frightened husband. 5 days after Manjit was reported missing, however, her remains were found on a beach near Roberts Bank in Delta, British Columbia, south of Vancouver. The remains had been subjected to fire, a fact that significantly complicated the forensic examination, but that investigators were ultimately able to work around in building their case. An autopsy determined that the cause of death was strangulation. Investigators gathered evidence over the months that followed, examining the couple's relationship, the circumstances of the marriage, and the physical evidence available to them. It emerged that the marriage had been under considerable strain in the period leading up to Manjit's disappearance. There had been marital difficulties and tensions that family members and friends had been aware of, and the investigation established a picture of a relationship that was far less harmonious than its outward appearance had suggested. According to information that emerged through the parole process years later, Panghali had spent months before the crime harboring thoughts of harming his wife, a detail that speaks to the premeditated nature of what occurred. Mukhtiar Panghali was arrested in March 2007, 5 months after Manjit's disappearance, and was charged with second-degree murder and indignity to a human body. The trial of Mukhtiar Panghali was held in BC Supreme Court in New Westminster and presided over by Justice Heather Holmes. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence gathered from the body and from the scene where it was found, along with evidence about the state of the marriage and the timeline of events on the day of Manjit's disappearance. On February 4, 2011, after proceedings that had taken years, Justice Holmes delivered a verdict of guilty on the charge of second-degree murder and on the charge of indignity to a body. The reaction in the courtroom was immediate and emotional, with friends and family of Manjit in tears, and one person calling out in affirmation when the verdict was announced. At sentencing on March 17, 2011, Justice Holmes noted that there were significant aggravating factors in the case, including that the crime had been committed against a spouse, that the victim had been in a particularly vulnerable condition due to her pregnancy, and that the crime had been committed in the couple's home, a place that should be considered among the safest environments available to any person. Mukhtiar Panghali was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole, for a minimum of 15 years. Manjit's sister, Jasmine Bambra, who had taken on the responsibility of caring for the couple's daughter following Manjit's death, welcomed the sentence and told reporters that the court's decision reaffirmed her faith in the judicial system. Panghali appealed his conviction to the BC Court of Appeal, which dismissed the appeal in October 2012 after finding that the search of the family home had been justified and that the trial had been fair and properly conducted. He also sought to have the United States Supreme Court review the case, a petition that was not accepted. Years passed. Then, in July 2022, Panghali was granted day parole by the Parole Board of Canada, a decision that caused significant public concern and was met with criticism from advocates for victims of domestic violence. He obtained full-time employment during his day parole period. In October 2023, the Parole Board of Canada granted Mukhtiar Singh Panghali full parole, finding that his release did not present an undue risk to public safety. The decision referenced concerns that the board itself noted about the case, including the fact that Panghali had spent months planning the crime and had done so despite having other options available to him. The board also noted that his brother had testified in favor of release and had committed to monitoring his behavior. The decision to grant full parole to Mukhtiar Panghali was met with outrage by advocates for victims of intimate partner violence and by those who had followed Manjit's case closely over the years. Angela Marie McDougall of Battered Women's Support Services in Vancouver described the decision as a painful confirmation of how little the criminal legal system cares about women who are victims of femicide. Jasmine Bambra, who had raised Manjit's daughter in the years since her sister's death, spoke of the ongoing grief and the sense of injustice that accompanied the parole decision. The case remains a point of reference in Canadian discussions about the adequacy of sentencing and parole provisions in cases of domestic homicide, and it has been cited by advocates who argue that the current framework does not adequately reflect the gravity of intimate partner violence. Number 8. Raven Abaroa, the husband with the ironclad alibi. The case of Raven Abaroa is one that illustrates the extraordinary patience and persistence that investigators sometimes need to bring to complex homicide cases in which the evidence available is circumstantial, the timeline is contested, and the perpetrator has constructed what appears, at first examination, to be a virtually unassailable account of his own whereabouts at the time the crime was committed. It is also a case that demonstrates the profound limitations of a criminal justice system that sometimes requires years, multiple trials, and an Alford plea to reach even a qualified resolution, leaving the victim's family without the full measure of acknowledgement that a first-degree murder conviction would have provided. Janet Marie Christensen Abaroa was 25 years old and lived in Durham, North Carolina. She was a former collegiate soccer player who had met her husband Raven Samuel Abaroa at Southern Utah University, where both had been students. Janet was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and her faith and her community were central to who she was. By the spring of 2005, she and Raven had been married for nearly 2 years. They had a 6-month-old son named Caden, and Janet was pregnant with the couple's second child. On the surface, the family appeared to be in a period of building and growth, a young couple navigating the ordinary challenges of early parenthood and new beginnings. Beneath that surface, however, the marriage was under severe stress. Raven Abaroa had been living a life that was substantially different from the one he presented to his wife and community. He had been engaged in affairs with multiple women. He had been stealing from his employer, a sports equipment company where both he and Janet worked, and had been caught and charged with embezzlement of a significant amount of equipment and money. He had pleaded guilty to those charges, but avoided jail time. Janet had learned about at least one of his affairs and had confronted him about it. The couple separated for a period, and during that separation, Janet discovered she was pregnant. Raven returned to the family home, and the couple attempted to rebuild the marriage. On the evening of April 26, 2005, Raven Abaroa told Janet he was going to play soccer with friends in Morrisville, approximately 30 miles from their Durham home. He left the house. Later that night, he called 911 from their home and told the dispatcher in a distressed voice that his wife had been shot or something, and that there was blood everywhere. When investigators arrived, they found Janet Abaroa in an upstairs room, having been stabbed multiple times. She was deceased. Their son Caitlynne was in the adjacent room, unharmed. There was no sign of forced entry into the home. Valuable items were untouched. A knife was reported missing, along with a laptop, elements that Raven initially pointed to as evidence of a home invasion. An autopsy confirmed the cause of death as multiple stab wounds, and also confirmed that Janet was pregnant at the time of her death. Raven Abaroa appeared to have an alibi in the form of teammates from his soccer game who confirmed he had been present at the match in Morrisville. He maintained consistently that he had come home to find his wife and that an unknown intruder was responsible for her death. Police from the Durham Police Department investigated the case and gathered circumstantial evidence, including the embezzlement background, the affairs, the life insurance policy that Raven had recently taken out on Janet, the missing knife from his personal collection, and the pattern of his relationship with his wife in the months preceding the crime. However, the case was not pursued to arrest in the years immediately following the homicide, a decision that would later come under scrutiny. In the years after Janet's death, Raven Abaroa remarried a woman named Vanessa Pond, and moved to the state of Idaho. His second marriage also reportedly involved domestic violence and controlling behavior, according to testimony that Vanessa Pond would later provide. In February 2010, nearly 5 years after Janet's death, the Durham Police Department reopened the case, following a review by a new detective who identified inconsistencies and gaps in the original investigation. Raven Abaroa was arrested in Idaho and extradited to North Carolina, where he was charged with first-degree murder. The trial of Raven Abaroa began in May 2013 and lasted approximately 5 weeks. Vanessa Pond testified for the prosecution and described her former husband's behavior in terms that were consistent with the pattern of controlling and abusive conduct that investigators had come to associate with the case. The jury deliberated but was unable to reach a unanimous verdict, with reports indicating a split of 11-1 in favor of conviction. The judge declared a mistrial. Rather than proceed to a second full trial, Raven Abaroa entered into an Alford plea in March 2014, pleading guilty to voluntary manslaughter, while formally maintaining that he was not admitting guilt, but acknowledging that the evidence was sufficient to support a conviction. The plea significantly reduced the sentence he faced. A judge sentenced him to between 95 and 123 months in prison, crediting the time he had already served. Raven Abaroa was released from prison on December 25, 2017, having served approximately 8 years. Janet's family responded to the plea agreement with a statement that said Raven had finally admitted, after almost 9 years, that he had in fact taken Janet's life, and that he had not only taken hers, but had also knowingly ended the life of his unborn child. They expressed that no amount of time in prison could adequately represent the loss they had suffered. The shortness of the sentence and the early release of Raven Abaroa is a source of ongoing grief and frustration for Janet's family and for those who followed the case. The case is a study in the challenges faced by prosecutors in cases where the physical evidence is circumstantial and an alibi, however imperfect, is available to the defense. It is also a study in the particular pain experienced by families of victims when the resolution of a case feels partial, when the sentence feels incommensurate with the loss, and when the person responsible eventually walks out of prison and resumes an ordinary life. Number 9. Drew Garnier, the husband who wanted a boy. The case of Drew Garnier is one of the most recent in this collection, having occurred in September 2024 and been resolved through sentencing in May 2025. And it is a case that carries within it a detail so stark and so incomprehensible that it has been described by virtually everyone who has covered the story as among the most disturbing motivations ever cited in a domestic homicide case. According to the victim impact statement read into court by Samantha Garnier's father, the man who took his daughter's life did so in part because she was carrying a girl, because she was pregnant with the couple's third daughter when he had wanted a son. That motive, stripped of any justification or excuse, reduces a human life and the lives of 2 children who survived to a question of gender preference, a detail that is almost impossible to comprehend and that has provoked an intense response from those who have encountered the story. Samantha J. Garnier was 29 years old at the time of her death. She and her husband Drew J. Garnier lived in Masonville, a small community in Delaware County in the Catskills region of upstate New York. The couple had 2 daughters together, aged 6 and 9 years old at the time of the events of September 4, 2024, and Samantha was 5 months pregnant with what would have been the couple's third child. According to her father's statement to the court, Drew Garnier had been hoping for a son. When it became clear that the pregnancy was another daughter, according to her father, Drew's response was not acceptance or love, but something far darker. On September 4, 2024, shortly before midnight, New York State Police responded to a domestic dispute at the Garnier residence on Houck Road in the town of Masonville. What officers found when they arrived was a scene of devastating violence. Samantha Garnier had been subjected to a severe attack with a bladed weapon inside the family home. The couple's 2 daughters, aged 6 and 9, had also been attacked during the same incident, and both sustained serious injuries. Drew Garnier was located at the scene and surrendered to police without a struggle. He was treated at a local hospital for superficial injuries before being taken into custody. Samantha Garnier was airlifted to UHS Wilson Medical Center in Binghamton, where she was subsequently transferred to Upstate Medical Center in Syracuse. She was pronounced dead at that facility. Her unborn daughter also did not survive. Both children were airlifted to Upstate Medical Center and received treatment. Investigators confirmed that both girls were expected to make a full recovery. Drew Garnier was charged initially with second-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted second-degree murder. A Delaware County grand jury indicted him within days of his arrest on those charges, along with additional weapons counts. He was held in the Delaware County Jail without bail pending trial. As the case moved through the courts, prosecutors and the district attorney's office made the decision to pursue a plea agreement, taking into account the significant trauma that would be inflicted on the 2 surviving daughters if they were required to testify at trial about what they had witnessed and experienced on the night their mother was taken from them. In March 2025, Drew Garnier appeared in Delaware County Court and pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter and 2 counts of first-degree assault, charges that reflected both the killing of Samantha and the serious injuries he had inflicted on the couple's daughters. On May 13, 2025, Delaware County Court Judge John L. Hubbard presided over the sentencing of Drew Garnier. Before the sentence was read, Samantha's father addressed the court and delivered a victim impact statement in which he described his daughter and named the motive that he believed had driven the crime, that Drew Garnier had wanted a boy. He then told the court that he had adopted the 2 girls himself and that he would protect them. The statement was followed by Judge Hubbard's remarks, in which he told Garnier directly that he had taken a life and injured his own children who had a right to expect protection from their father, not harm. The judge sentenced Drew Garnier to 30 years in state prison, followed by 15 years of post-release supervision, An additional dimension of the sentencing involved the question of Drew Garnier's contact with his daughters during his incarceration. Garnier himself requested the ability to maintain contact with the girls he had attacked. District Attorney Sean Smith objected and sought no contact orders for the maximum period permitted by law. Judge Hubbard issued comprehensive stay-away orders, set to expire in 2056, though he noted that the girls themselves would have the ability to seek modification of those orders if they chose to do so when they reached adulthood. Drew Garnier refused to sign the no-contact orders, a final act of defiance that observers noted as consistent with the controlling and self-centered behavior that had characterized the entire case. The case of Drew Garnier attracted national and international attention, in large part because of the reported motive, and that attention has forced a renewed conversation about the ways in which gender preference continues to operate as a destructive force in some families, and about the connections between controlling behavior, intimate partner violence, and the dynamics of power within a household. For Samantha Garnier's family, the 30-year sentence represents a measure of justice, though District Attorney Smith acknowledged in his remarks that the plea and sentence were not perfect, and that the decision had been made with the specific well-being of the two surviving children as the primary consideration. Samantha's father's adoption of the girls ensures that they will be cared for by someone who loved their mother and who has made a public commitment to their protection and their future. Number 10. David Temple, the football coach with a secret life. The case of David Temple is one that demonstrates, with striking force, the way in which the pursuit of justice can be a decades-long process, a process that requires not just one trial, but three, that spans more than 20 years. And that is complicated at every stage by the resources, connections, and persistence of a defendant who was determined to avoid accountability for what prosecutors argued was a planned and deliberate act carried out against a woman who was 8 months pregnant with their first child. The Temple case is set in Katy, Texas, a suburban community west of Houston, and its central figure is a man who was, in his community, a well-known and well-regarded figure, a high school football coach whose public persona was one of authority and respectability. David Temple was a football coach at Katy High School and was described by those who knew him professionally as driven, competitive, and capable. He was married to Belinda Temple, who was 30 years old at the time of her death, and was 8 months pregnant with the couple's first child. By the evidence presented at trial, Belinda Temple was a warm and devoted woman who was looking forward enormously to the birth of her child, and whose relationship with David was one she appears to have believed was more stable than it in fact was. What Belinda did not know, or did not fully understand the implications of, was that David Temple had been conducting a romantic affair with a woman named Heather Scott, a fellow teacher, that had been ongoing for some time before Belinda's death. On January 16, 1999, Belinda Temple was found at the family home in Katy. She was deceased, having suffered a fatal wound to the back of the head from a close-range firearm discharge. Investigators initially suspected that the crime was connected to a burglary that appeared to have occurred at the property, and the case was treated initially as a robbery gone wrong rather than as an intimate partner homicide. David Temple's 3-year-old son Evan was in the home at the time of his mother's death. David Temple was at first treated as a grieving widower rather than as a suspect, and the investigation in its early stages did not result in charges being filed against him. Over the years that followed, however, investigators re-examined the case, and the body of evidence began to point more conclusively toward David Temple as the person responsible for Belinda's death. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. David Temple had ended his wife's life because he wanted to be with Heather Scott and because he saw the impending birth of a child as a complication to his desired exit from the marriage. Prosecutors argued that the staged appearance of a burglary was an attempt to misdirect the investigation. In 2007, more than 8 years after Belinda's death, David Temple was charged with her murder and brought to trial for the first time. The jury convicted him of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. David Temple appealed his conviction, and in 2016, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned it, finding that the prosecution had withheld evidence from the defense team during the original trial. The ruling was controversial and devastating for Belinda Temple's family, who had waited years for accountability and then watched it be removed through a procedural finding. Temple was released from prison pending his retrial, which meant that for a period he was a free man. The retrial resulted in a second conviction by a jury, but that jury was unable to reach agreement on the appropriate sentence, which resulted in the extraordinary circumstance of a third trial, held in 2023, to determine sentencing alone. At the 2023 sentencing trial, the jury heard testimony about the case and about the impact of Belinda Temple's death on those who had loved her. Her brother and sister provided victim impact statements. Prosecutors argued that Temple had shown no genuine remorse across the decades that the case had consumed, and that the only appropriate sentence was the maximum available under Texas law. The jury agreed. David Temple was sentenced to life in prison in 2023, more than 24 years after Belinda's death. He appealed the sentence, and as of 2026, that appeal has been denied, with the reporting from COO confirming that the life sentence stands and that David Temple has lost his final appeal. The Temple case attracted renewed attention in recent years, not only because of its extraordinary procedural history, but also because of the involvement of Evan Temple, the young son who was in the home when his mother was taken. Evan Temple, who was raised by Heather Scott after his father's incarceration and who maintained that he wanted his father freed, testified at the 2023 sentencing trial in support of his father. He told the jury that he had lost his father once and did not want to lose him again. Heather Scott also testified, telling the jury that she and David Temple had never spoken about Belinda's death in the 18 years they were married, a statement that prosecutors found difficult to accept as credible given the circumstances. The jury, clearly, found it equally unconvincing. For Belinda Temple's family, the path to a final outcome consumed decades of their lives, decades during which they had to live with the knowledge that the man they held responsible for their loss was at times free and at times appealing through the courts, in ways that kept reopening a wound that could never fully close. Belinda Temple was 8 months pregnant when she died, a woman who was weeks away from meeting her child and who was living what she believed was an ordinary life in a suburban Texas community. The fact that it took 3 trials and more than 20 years to reach a final sentence is a reflection not of any failure of will on the part of those who sought justice for her, but of the complexity of the legal system and the resources available to defendants who are determined to fight every finding at every stage. The final outcome, a life sentence affirmed on appeal, means that accountability has been reached, however delayed, and it is an outcome that Belinda Temple's family has described as the justice they sought for a woman who deserved far better than what was done to her.